Picture it, April 1912. The eyes of the entire world are locked on a single massive vessel. In this explainer, we're stepping back in time to examine one of the most famous, frankly most tragic events in human history, the story of the RMS Titanic. It was the world's largest, most luxurious passenger ship, setting out on its highly anticipated maiden voyage. But understanding the Titanic isn't just about brushing up on maritime history. It's a really profound lesson in ambition, engineering, and the stark limits of human control. So what exactly happens when the greatest achievement of modern engineering goes head-to-head with the unpredictable power of nature? Well, that's the central question we're unpacking today. At the time, the Titanic was hailed as the absolute pinnacle, literally the greatest achievement in modern engineering. But as we're going to see, when you collide human overconfidence with the sheer force of nature, the results can be devastating. And honestly, it's a question that still hits close to home today, as we keep building bigger and more advanced technologies. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the engineering or the timeline of the voyage, we really have to ground ourselves in the reality of what happened. Just 4 days into that trip, more than 15 people lost their lives. It's a staggering human cost, and it's exactly why this story still commands our attention. Over a century later, it absolutely remains one of history's most devastating disasters. And there's this deeply tragic irony at the very heart of the story. The public, the media, and even a lot of the engineers genuinely believed this vessel was practically unsinkable. That exact phrase just became permanently glued to the ship's identity. But as we all know, the impossible happened. The massive gap between what we believed our technology could withstand and what actually occurred out there in the Atlantic. That's the real core of this tragedy. Okay, part 1. Building the dream ship back in the early 20th century. The competition between major shipping companies was absolutely fierce. They were all trying to outdo each other. So the White Star Line decided to just go all in and build the most luxurious ocean liner the world had ever seen. To understand the sheer ambition here, you really have to look at the scale. Construction kicked off in 1909 in Ireland, Belfast, and the result was a vessel weighing more than 46,000 tons. And on top of that massive weight, she stretched over 269 meters long. I mean, this wasn't just a ship, right? It was basically a floating city, built to carry over 22 passengers and crew. And it wasn't just huge, it was stunning. The White Star Line packed the ship with these lavish amenities honestly felt like science fiction at the time. We're talking onboard swimming pools, fine dining rooms, electric elevators, which by the way were a massive novelty back then, and that breathtaking grand staircase, crowned with an ornate glass dome. Just to put it in perspective, a first-class parlor suite could cost the equivalent of over $100,000 in today's money for so many people. The Titanic represented the very future of travel, a literal monument to luxury, and as it turned out, human hubris. Moving on to part 2. The maiden voyage. So construction is wrapped up and the vibe is just electric. On April 10th, 1912, the journey officially begins. And this ship brought together a really unique cross-section of society. You've got ultra-wealthy business leaders sitting up in first class and hopeful immigrants looking for a fresh start in America. Down in third class, they set off from Southampton, England the next day. She makes brief stops in France and Ireland to pick up a few more passengers. Then from April 12th through the 14th, the ship is just steadily cruising across the Atlantic toward New York City at this point. Pretty much no one on board could have possibly imagined the nightmare that was waiting for them. Which brings us to part 3. Striking the iceberg as night fell on April 14th. The ship was cutting through the dark, freezing waters of the North Atlantic. And here is a really critical, devastating detail. The sea was eerily calm that night, like unusually still. Counterintuitively, this actually made icebergs way harder to spot, without waves breaking against the base of the ice to create that visible white foam. They were practically invisible in the pitch black. And what makes this so much worse is that the Titanic had already received several radio warnings about ice in the area, yet they just kept barreling forward at high speed. Then it all happens terrifyingly fast. At 11:40 p.m., the lookouts finally spot an iceberg dead ahead. The crew desperately tries to turn, but look, a 46,000-ton vessel does not stop or pivot on a dime. Barely a minute later, at 11:41 p.m., the iceberg scrapes violently along the starboard side. And that scrape was fatal. It tore open just enough of the watertight compartments to pull the bow down. It's kind of like Imagine water spilling over the little dividers in an ice cube tray. Once the front fills up, it just tips right over the internal into the next compartment. And the next by the early hours of April 15th. The bow is slipping beneath the freezing sea. Part for the final hours. Now, when the ship first struck the iceberg, a lot of passengers actually didn't think it was a big deal. They've been told the ship was unsinkable, right? But the fatal engineering flaw wasn't just the hole beneath the water. It was the terrifying math happening up on deck. There were over 22 people on board. But the Titanic carried far fewer lifeboat spaces. So as the ship starts noticeably filling with water, and the crew begins the incredibly grim task of loading the boats, you can imagine panic just naturally begins to spread. In the middle of all that horrific chaos, families were tragically separated, since women and children were prioritized for the handful of available seats. Crew members were working frantically to save whoever they could. And incredibly, you've probably heard the story, but it's true under the direction of bandmaster Wallace Hartley. The ship's musicians actually stayed on the slanting deck, playing their instruments, in a desperate attempt to calm the frightened passengers. Ultimately, the enormous ship broke completely and disappeared into the freezing Atlantic. And keep in mind, the water temperature right then was a lethal 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That freezing water claimed hundreds of lives in just minutes. Hours later, another passenger ship, the Carpathia, finally arrived on the scene. But out of the more than 22 people who originally boarded the Titanic, the Carpathia was only able to rescue about 700 survivors. When the news hit the mainland, newspapers were flooded with these heartbreaking stories of courage, sacrifice, and survival. The whole world was just left completely in shock by the massive loss of life. Part 5: Discovering the Wreck. Following the immediate grief of the disaster, a decades-long mystery really took hold. For over 70 years, the exact location of the Titanic was a complete unknown. It was basically a ghost ship, resting somewhere out there in the vast dark of the Atlantic. It actually wasn't until 1985 that the mystery was finally solved. The wreckage was discovered at a staggering depth of 3,800 meters. That is nearly 4 kilometers straight down under the ocean's surface, isolated under totally crushing pressure. Just locating it was a monumental, incredibly difficult task. The expedition that finally pinpointed it was led by Ocean Robert Ballard, and what they saw down there confirmed the terrifying final moments of the vessel. The ship lay on the ocean floor, split into 2 massive sections. But what was maybe most haunting was that, scattered all across the seafloor, were thousands of personal belongings, shoes, plates, luggage. Seeing these everyday recognizable items just lying there in the sill really humanized the tragedy all over again. It completely renewed worldwide interest in the men and children who actually made that voyage. And finally, Part 6. A legacy of safety. The Titanic is obviously a massive historical tragedy, but it also forced a total reckoning in maritime travel. Almost overnight, international rules were completely overhauled. The disaster directly led to the creation of the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea. Today, it is strictly, legally mandated that ships have to carry enough lifeboats for absolutely everyone on board. On top of that, specialized ice patrols were set up to constantly monitor dangerous waters, and emergency communication systems got a massive upgrade. So by fundamentally changing how the world navigates the oceans, the Titanic tragedy directly saved countless lives. In the decades that followed. Over a century later, the Titanic still deeply fascinates historians, filmmakers, and just millions of everyday people. It's become this lasting symbol of ambition, tragedy, and human resilience. Above all, it reminds us that even our very greatest achievements are still vulnerable to the raw, sheer forces of nature. So as we keep pushing the boundaries of modern technology building things we swear are foolproof, you have to wonder, are we ever truly unsinkable?